This is Joe Brightman, and thanks for coming today to the Tank at Towson. With us today, we have a guest presenter, Dr. Elizabeth Berquist from our College of Education here at Towson. And the topic of her presentation is Universal Design for Learning, otherwise known as UDL, which is a set of principles or guidelines that are designed to increase access and effectiveness among your students. So at this time, I'd like to pass the presentation off to Dr. Berquist.
Thank you, Joe. I'm excited to have the opportunity to do this. I think the Tank at Towson is a great idea to get ideas out and share them with folks on our campus and actually anywhere. So thanks for the opportunity. I just want to talk a little bit about some of the goals for the session today. So I've spent a lot of time here at Towson and in other places talking about just the basics of UDL. So I'd like to just really quickly go over a little backgrounds, but then this was designed to be almost a level 2 type discussion because the assumption is that many folks have a background in UDL now, which is outstanding because of the hard work of many people. So I'd like to really focus this on the second tier. You know, I understand a bit about UDL, but now I want to think about how to apply. So that's where we're going today. So just in case there's anyone on the webinar who doesn't have much of a background on UDL, I just would like to reiterate some of the things that you said. UDL is really a framework. So in my mind, it's a way of thinking about teaching and learning, and it's a way of considering how you design your classroom. And much of that is based on the UDL guidelines. And the guidelines are derived from what we know about neuroscience. So you can see those 3 pictures of the brain, and there's lots and lots of different models. So if you read anything about brain research, you're going to find millions of things because that's what models are there to do. But what CAST uses, and CAST really is the foundational group in UDL, they conceptualized the framework in the 80s, and it's evolved and grown since then. But what they use is the model that you see here, and that's the affective, strategic, and recognition network. So that's the lens that we use when we look at strategies in the classroom. So because we know that those 3 networks are so strong, there's certain patterns that we can identify, and then we can apply them to our instruction. And what we've done here at Towson, and you'll see some screenshots on the next slide about our program here, we have spent some time really diving into what is Universal Design for Learning and what does it look like in higher education. And that's the screenshot that says UDL at Towson University. And that's a professional development network that's been led by the Office of Academic Innovation. We have faculty members who have learned about the framework and the 3 principles and the 9 guidelines, and then have had a chance to apply it in professional learning communities and into their practice. And what we'll do at the end of this presentation is we'll put a link on the screen so that you can actually access some of those materials. Yeah, absolutely. So the other piece is UDL on campus. So this is a product of CAST and a couple other groups, and it talks a lot about how you can apply the UDL framework in higher education. And some of the work here, Dr. Grasmick's office, the Presidential Scholar UDL Project, and some of the work of the Special Education Department with Dr. Neville and the College of Ed, some of the things that we've done to kind of spread the word about UDL are featured on that site. So if you don't have a background on UDL and you want to learn more, those are 2 really great places to look.
So we do have a very developed resource network here.
Absolutely.
Who would you recommend to contact to get connected with this group?
If you are on campus at Towson University, you will definitely want to contact the Office of Academic Innovation. There's many, many professional learning opportunities from OAI. And if you're not on Towson's campus, I would go to the UDL on campus site, and I would also go to the National UDL Center. It's udlcenter.org, and that site is kept up by CAST, and there's fantastic resources on that site as well.
Great.
So I put a quote on here that I think is a perfect one to think about designing teaching and learning, when you want to frame how I'm going to use the UDL framework in my classroom. So as I've thought more and more about this, one of the most important things that I've learned about UDL is that learner variability is something that can be planned for. And that doesn't really make sense because variability is about being different. But when you really think about it, there's patterns in that variability. Now, we know that not all of those patterns can be planned for, but some of that variability is systematic. So if you understand that and you believe that and you read some of the research behind it, which you can certainly do on your own time, but I'm not going to dive into that in our short presentation today, you know that you can design in advance. So that's where I'm going to focus today. How can we design our learning environments in advance to meet the needs of learner variability? And we're going to do two things. We're going to talk about it just globally for a few minutes, and then we're going to spend the bulk of the time thinking really specifically about one of those three UDL guidelines that I showed you at the beginning.
Great.
So this first image and this question, if some variability is systematic, how can we design for it in advance? So the global question I want you to ask you is ask yourself, when you start to plan for your semester, so we're at the end of the spring semester, when you start to plan for the summer or the fall semester, the first thing I want you to ask yourself is, what's my learning environment like? So I just have a couple pictures there of classrooms. Yours might look like this. It might look entirely different. You might be out in the field supervising. But the first question is, before your students even walk in the door, what options can you put in place that meet their needs? And the first is to consider this physical learning environment. And that's a big picture type question, but it's an easy way to think of options from the beginning. So if you have a syllabus that you've written, what are options for students to access that? If you have assignments that you plan before you even know your learners, what options are there in those assignments? And then the physical structure of your classroom. How do you set it up so that students can collaborate and communicate? So those are some questions to consider just on a global level.
This makes perfect sense as well, because the first thing that you would see as a student is your environment, and it sets the scene for everything else that's about to happen.
Right, absolutely. And then the other piece is that you start to think, so after you consider the learning environment in general, you start to think about those three UDL principles. And I have the networks up here on the screen because I think the two that we really spend the most time focusing on are the recognition network and the strategic network. I think we've done a really good job in higher education of thinking about how we represent content to students and how we give them options to show what they know. So the recognition network, the what of learning, I know when I walk into my introductory, freshman or sophomore class and I give them a textbook, that's probably not enough for my students. I want to be able to offer more than just that print copy text. That's a great choice, that's a great option, there's nothing wrong with the print text, but I also want to be able to offer them the digital version. I want to offer them links to videos that support it. I want to offer them the ability to listen. Many of our publishers now have downloadable audio versions that students can listen to. So I think across campus in higher education, I think we're doing a good job of giving more than just the standard text to represent content. And then I also think we're doing a good job of giving students options to show us how they know. Many places we have not just your standard term paper or your midterm exam. We have instructors who are doing project-based learning. We have instructors who are getting students out in the field to communicate with community members. We have group activities. So I think we're really thinking about that, and we've done a good job. So, and obviously we can learn more with those two UDL principles, offering options for representation and action and expression. But that's for another presentation. So today, the area where I think we really need to think a little bit harder, not because we've done anything wrong, just because this is an area where we haven't spent a ton of time in higher education, is how we support effective networks of our learners. And that's how do we, as faculty members, offer multiple means of engagement for our students.
Yeah, and so jumping backwards just one step, well, the way I'm hearing this is that essentially, to recap, we know that humans will be different, and our two main goals in UDL are essentially input and output, to vary those styles of how are we presenting our information to students, as well as how are we expecting them to show us that they understand. Absolutely,
absolutely. And layered with all of that is this idea of affects. And there's a colleague at CAST who is absolutely fabulous. Her name is Dr. Sammy Daly, and she's done a lot of research on UDL and affects. And one of the things that always sticks with me when I think about her work is that learning is emotional work. And we don't think about that often. That's something that we don't consider all the time. So one of the things that I want to challenge you, again, when you're planning, is to think about what does it take to be successful in school? So since you're sitting here with me, I'm going to throw it out to you. So if I say, Joe, what does it take for a student to be successful in school? What are some of the first things that pop into your head?
Well, I think the first one to me is a home network that's supportive, and a family that is supportive of your learning and interested in that. Coming more towards a classroom, I think a few of the typical concepts that I know about being successful in school essentially are students will need to understand their expectations, will also need to have a bit of a, and this is less as you go lower on the scale, but as you move higher through K-12 and into higher ed, students often perform well with some autonomy and some choice and decisions that they can make as they learn. And really, more than anything else, I think, and I'm sure you're going to bring up many topics that are just as important, but I think that the student needs to feel that they're able to succeed and feel that they can use those channels.
Absolutely. So I think that's a pretty common response. Anyone that we ask, higher education, K-12, they discuss many of the things that you did. You talked about having a supportive network, whether it's your family or your classroom community or your campus community. You talked about being able to self-regulate, being able to set a goal and back map to accomplish that task. You talked about having that feeling that you can be successful. So that, to me, those are all things that are connected to that affective network and providing multiple means of engagement. You didn't mention the type of materials they use. You didn't mention the products that they create. Now, those are important. They're extremely important. But people often mention those things that we consider like non-cognitive, even though they're not. There's no such thing as non-cognitive tasks or skills. Everything is. But in the classroom, we don't think about those affective tasks and skills off the bat. When we design, and I say this from my own personal experience, when I find out when my department chair says, okay, you're teaching this new class, the first thing I do is say, okay, well, let me design this syllabus. I have to think about what are my course goals and my objectives, and those are all really important. But when we step back and we look at that big picture, that's something that has to come after that student feels like they're interested, that we've recruited their interest, that we have helped them, and once we've recruited their interest, that we help them to sustain that effort throughout the semester, and then that they eventually can self-regulate. And those are the things that you talked about. So that's very telling to me that focusing on the engagement principle is really important. So once we've agreed on that, and we say, okay, I understand that it takes a lot of emotional skills and affective skills to be successful in a higher education setting. Now, what does that mean for me as a faculty member? And that's what we're going to focus on. When you go to the UDL Center, the CAST website, the Towson University site, you're going to see the UDL guidelines. And if you look at anything that is color-coded in green, those are all of the components of the UDL framework that are designed to give faculty members ideas to support affective networks. So if you think that that's important to you, you want to open up the guidelines and you want to look at any of those pieces that are in green. And I have them here. We're going to talk about each of them. We're going to talk about recruiting interest first, then we're going to talk about sustaining effort and persistence, and then we're going to talk about self-regulation. And what my goal is for folks who are listening on this webinar to understand what those UDL guidelines are, and then some specific strategies that they can employ in their classrooms to support their students in those areas.
Yeah, so stepping back again, it seems like we have some opinions and ideas as educators that are great. And most of us do have a pretty good grip on what our students are doing. But then it sounds like UDL asks us to take a slightly deeper look, to take a peek under the surface and to really think about those cognitive processes that enable the student's brain to intake the information that you are presenting, as well as express to you that they've achieved it.
Absolutely. And that's kind of important to talk about, because one of the biggest misconceptions of universal design for learning is that it is all about the design of your syllabus or your lesson or your module for the week or your units, and then it's about technology too. That's another big misconception. So UDL is actually a pretty complex framework. All of those are pieces that tie into the UDL framework, but what's most important is understanding how learner variability is connected to those three networks. And in my mind, and many of the colleagues that study and really think about UDL, we really feel like the engagement network or the engagement principle is the most important, because if we can't hook our students in and keep them interested, then what does it matter if we offer multiple means of engagement or excuse me, affection, expression, or representation?
Absolutely. If it doesn't mean something and if
Right.
it doesn't make a personal connection,
Right.
then it won't stick as well.
Right, right. So let's talk a little bit about these 3 guidelines underneath the principle of multiple means of engagement. The first one, which is really about access to me, is recruiting interest. These are things that you can think of at the start of the semester, strategies that faculty can embed into their course design before they even meet the students. And at first glance, you think this is all about choice. So yes, this guideline encourages faculty members to give their students choice, but it's more than that. It's also making the work that the students are doing relevant. And it's also minimizing threats and distractions. And we often leave that out when we think about recruiting interest, but students can't really get into a topic or even into a class if they don't feel like it's a safe space for them too. So a couple things that we can do. And I have up here a couple questions that I challenge you to ask yourself, and then a few things that may be easy that you can embed right away. So the first question is, what opportunities are there to build a supportive learning environment when students come in your class? So simple things like, do you learn the students' names right away? There's apps that allow you to take pictures of your students, and it goes with your daily attendance, so you can take attendance and you can learn their name and their face at the same time. Simple things like grading students when they walk in your classroom. That's a great way to build that supportive environment. Do you have to have your syllabus finished when the semester begins? Or is there any input for students when you design that syllabus? It's not a horrible thing to have an incomplete component where students are helping you design. How about setting personal and academic goals? We have goals for students on our syllabus, and it says, this is what you have to accomplish, and absolutely that's important. That's part of the way that we are accredited. But why can't students set their own semester goals or their unit goals? Outcome-based learning objectives. So things like problem-based learning and case-based learning, these are authentic strategies that faculty members can use to get students out into that real world. Opportunities to present to real audiences. That's another way to support that affective network. If students know that their product is going to be out in the real world, that amps up things a bit. One example is I teach a technology course, and we adapt books for community centers. And the students know that their books are going to students with disabilities who are, under 5 years old. So that's pretty neat. That amps up the quality of their adapted book. And then finally, active participation. So when you ask students to participate in your class, is it active? And by that, I mean beyond discussion. Because we know that some students don't like to discuss. They're not comfortable speaking up in class. So how can you actively get them to discuss without necessarily speaking up? And there's things from low-tech whiteboards to pinch cards where you have A, B, and C, and students hold things up, all the way to more high-tech, like using clickers in your classroom, using cell phones with Pull Everywhere. So that's a really important thing to get students to participate when they might not be ready to orally participate. Hopefully by the end of the semester they'll feel comfortable enough, but just to recruit that interest and get them involved, maybe we can think of some ideas like that. And on the next slide, I have a couple screenshots of some of my favorite ways to help to recruit interest and minimize threats and distractions for students. And the first is thinking about charts and calendars and schedules. Many universities have email systems that have built-in calendars. Not all of our students know how to work those. So maybe when you go over your syllabus at the beginning, take a couple minutes, have students put in your major assignments, back map it, and have them put in some due dates before the due dates, so you're chunking those assignments for them. If they keep a low-tech calendar, they can have out their calendar book while the other students are doing it digitally. If you don't have access to that, Google Calendars does it for free. It'll send reminders to their phones. So again, that's something we would expect our students to do on their own. However, we know patterns that they don't all come to us with that ability. So if we can model that at the beginning of the semester, that certainly helps to keep those students on task. I also have visual timers here. So many of us teach really long classes. We might teach a 3-hour class or even a 90-minute class. giving students a task and putting them in group work, and just simple things like displaying an online stopwatch or a countdown timer so students know how much time is left to help them keep them on task. I have preview what is coming next year. This is important because students really get bogged down. I know this time of the semester especially, there's lots and lots of assignments that are due. So at the end of every class, after you close, could you preview what's coming up? Can you send an email out to students and let them know that, you know, this assignment is coming in 2 weeks? Again, things that we would expect them to do, but you're really helping them. And then thinking about just the length of the class and the timing, and just making them feel like breaks are okay. You know, that's reducing threats and distractions, building in those components in your class. And then again, I have a reminder to involve all the students in the presentation, and I have links to Today's Meet and Socrative. They're both free apps. Today's Meet is like a back channel, so students can be asking questions online and you can see them, and when they go on a break, you come back and you address the questions that they posted after the break. Socrative is basically a quiz app, but you can display their results on the screen, and then students know how they're performing. I mean, I even like to ask things as simple as how many of you read 100% of the chapter, 75%, 50%, so I know at the beginning of the class. So again, these are things that you can come back to on your own and look at, but I wanted you to have some concrete strategies to help recruit interest.
That's great. And so it's almost like the business process of attaining buy-in from a partner, or in a training program, attaining buy-in from the trainees. And really not just getting buy-in, but organizing what you're presenting in a way that is comprehensible and attractive and functional for the student.
Absolutely, and it's proactive. So it's happening with the design of your instruction. It's not something you do after the fact. So my students aren't turning in assignments, so now I'm going to go back and do the calendar. You're going to do that from the get-go, because some students really need it, but all of them are probably going to benefit from that. Sure. So the second principle, or excuse me, the second guideline underneath the options for engagement principle is sustaining effort and persistence. And there's 4 checkpoints, which you can read on the screen, but these are things that I think faculty members can consider, you know, once you have your students hooked into your class and you really want to keep them going. You want to keep them motivated, and you want to help them keep that effort and persistence up throughout the semester. So a few questions that I have that I want you to consider. Many of our assignments are long-term, and they're things that might be due halfway through the semester, a quarter of the way through the semester. I know myself, I have signature assessments, and the rubric might be 6 or 7 pages long. So one of the things we started doing is chunking those assignments. So you might have part 1 due a month into the semester, and we give feedback and we give it back. And then you might have parts 2 and 3 due at the midterm. So taking those really large, very significant projects that are part of your signature assessments and chunking them in pieces so that it's not so overwhelming for the students. And I find as a faculty member, that's helpful to me too, because I feel like I can spend more time on my grading when I'm getting it in pieces, and then I can give my students better feedback that then they can change as they turn it in. The other question to ask yourself is, do you demonstrate the use of the scheduling tools? So that's not just recruiting interest, but it's also sustaining effort and persistence. So we talked about this in light of recruiting interest before with getting students to reducing threats and distractions, like that whole stress of, oh my gosh, I have to get all this done by the end of the semester. But you can also use these scheduling tools to help sustain that effort. And one way to sustain effort is to show students, like, you've accomplished this. Look at all the things that you've accomplished. Digital scheduling tools like checklists. When they have 10 things on that checklist in August or January, and then you can bring them back to it and you can show them that, okay, there's only 6 things on here and then there's 3 things. That's a way to help sustain that effort. They want to know that they have accomplished something throughout the semester. Prompts and scaffolds to visualize your desired outcome. And that's a lot of words, but to me, that's modeling assignments for students. So when you have something you want them to do, are you showing them what success looks like? When you have 7 things that go into one assignment, can you have a checklist so that the student uses that checklist? So you design it, these 7 items need to be in this summary that I want from you next week. Take the checklist with you, and then you use that to evaluate on your own. Not the instructor, that's for the student. Using rubrics. Rubrics are one of the most important things for helping students with executive functioning. And I found that there's a site called RubyStar that builds rubrics for you. So that's something that you can take and modify. It has the template, and then you can put your content in. The next question is asking yourself, are learners engaged in discussions about assessments? And that's another tough one, because oftentimes we say we want you to do A, B, and C, but the students might not have time to ask the questions. So I encourage taking that rubric and breaking it into pieces and having discussions about what it is so the students know the expectations before they're on their own. Then the last two questions, what tools are allowed, and do you have a growth or a fixed mindset? So asking yourself allowable tools. You know, this is a tough one sometimes, because often when we use instructional technology tools like listening to a text or having a video that supports content, I get a question, you know, are you decreasing the rigor? Or using a guided glossary or giving guided notes in a chapter. And I don't think so. I think that you're actually supporting students to get them to that higher level, because you're giving them scaffolds to be able to complete tasks that are harder. So think about tools that you have access to, you know, in your real life. I think about myself. I just did my taxes, and I had a lot of choices to do that. I have to do my taxes. It's a hard, you know, it's a challenging thing to do, to gather all that information and do the math, right? But I can use TurboTax. I can call a tax professional. I can have a colleague support me. There's so many things that I can do, and there's nothing wrong with that. So think about that with your own students. You know, what supports are out there that they can use? It's not decreasing the rigor. It's really leveling the playing field for all your students and giving them more options. And then growth or fixed mindset. This is something that's really important when considering affect. For a long time, we asked ourselves, you know, what's the student grade at the end? And now I think there's a lot of faculty members that are thinking about that process. You know, how much has my student grown throughout? And maybe you have some grades that are, yes, you have to master these content standards, and that's fixed. But could you possibly have a grade or two that has to do with growth, or has to do with, you know, reflection, which we're going to talk about in a minute, improvement? So those are things that are really crucial in sustaining that effort, giving students credit for improving.
A main theme in sustaining the engagement and growth, it seems to me like visibility comes through as a common theme in almost all of these. You're creating a scaffold that's visible and the student can see, as well as a path forward that the student sees as a way for them to go and achieve what they need to achieve.
Absolutely, absolutely. And on the next slide, I have just a couple links here that might help faculty members out, just ideas. And you said visible. So providing support for asking for help. Sometimes our students don't know how to ask for help. So if you can anticipate some of the things they'll struggle with, put them in your syllabus, put them on your Blackboard site. There's a screenshot at the top on APA formatting. There's 5 or 6 links. If you struggle with APA formatting, here's where you can go. Instead of them waiting for them to struggle with it on the first paper, put it in the syllabus, show it to the students. Group work is a big thing. We assume as faculty members that students come ready to participate in groups, and that's not always the case. There's a number of things on the web. I have a link to effective group work strategies for college classrooms, but we might need to go back to that K-12 mentality of assigning a role, giving students the expectation of what happens in group work. That's a challenge. Giving feedback that's frequent and timely and specific. One of the challenges that I had when I first started in higher education was some of the syllabi that I inherited had assessments at the middle and the end. And the student said, you know, I didn't like waiting months to get my first major feedback. So there is a fantastic book called Classroom Assessment Techniques, or CATS, by Angelo and Cross. You can also find a lot of free resources on the web. And they are small formative assessments that instructors can give every single session. You can grade them, you can make them anonymous, and you can look for patterns. That's where this whole idea of group feedback is really helpful. So you maybe at the end of a lecture, you ask students, what's your muddiest point? And then you collect all 30 and you sort the muddiest point. And when they come in, you can address that at the beginning of the next class. That's a great formative assessment. Now that's anonymous. You can also give you can also give feedback to students when they submit their work online. I know we use Blackboard here at Towson. There is, I have a screenshot at the bottom, there is a way that you can record yourself giving feedback. There's a lot of tools now, apps. I have the Show Me app and EduCreations link there, where you can record over top of student work. And again, that's different than grading and writing, and I feel like a lot of times we are correcting for students. If you're asking them questions, that's better feedback than us writing on the paper, what needs to be done. So think about using those more Web 2.0 type tools to be able to give students feedback.
Absolutely.
So the final UDL guideline that I'd like to talk about is self-regulation. And this is really the hardest one to get to, because when you look at the UDL guidelines, the bottom layer is really about getting students to become expert learners. And that's the goal of education. So that's tough. So there's 3 checkpoints that go along with this guideline. And I have a series of questions, again, just as we did with the other 2, that I think that are helpful to faculty members to ask themselves. So the first is, and let's flip to that so folks can follow with us. What types of prompts and reminders are useful in encouraging self-regulatory behavior? And these are things that we don't often think of, because again, if you are an instructor in higher ed, you're probably pretty good at self-regulating, because you have to. We have to do a lot of work independently. But our students might not be there yet. So something as simple as sending out an email that says, okay, this is what we talked about this week, and these are the things that need to be accomplished. Can you ask yourself, have you done A, B, and C? You also have access to Web 2.0 tools, where you can have anonymous rating scales. I mentioned the one on the chapter reading, but you can also ask students questions about, how do you feel you understood last week's objective? And you can display the graph on the screen so that students can see that and have that discussion. How about engaging students in self-regulation, in self-reflection? This is something where a lot of studies have shown some of the best learning takes place when you reflect. So do we give students opportunities to reflect? It's not just the product that they're coming to. So are we giving them coaching feedback, mentoring feedback, or are we giving them that stage on the stage feedback? And that's a tough one, because if we are measuring their ability to access to tell us about the content, that's one thing. It's yes, this is correct, this isn't correct. But there's other kinds of feedback that is more of along the lines of coaching. So think about the type of feedback that you give there. And then encouraging honesty in your students. That's hard. Are you being honest with yourself? Maybe they don't need to respond to all of these questions to you, but they're responding on their own. Something else that's really helpful is anticipating those difficult conversations. I've had students that come to class and they say things that, I'm not a good writer, so I just know I'm not going to be successful. So you can anticipate that and try to get them to change that conversation. Instead of saying I'm not good at it, to say, okay, well, how can I improve in this area? And that changes the tone, and it really helps students, because you're optimizing your belief that they're going to be successful, and you're helping them self-regulate by giving them those specific strategies. The final question I have is, when do you use real-life situations to demonstrate your own ability to cope with stressful situations or to self-regulate? So I'll often throw in personal anecdotes about myself, about my students, just different strategies that people can use to be successful when they're faced with a challenging task. That's not something that's content-specific, and it's something that is actually really meaningful, because we're all faced with tough situations. It's hard to be a college student, because they're straddling this young adult world. Oftentimes they're in a work internship, but they're also taking college classes, so they're juggling a lot of things. So recognizing that is really important. And I know even myself, I get wrapped up in my content sometimes, and I'm so focused on they have to do this assignment that I have to remember, if they're not there, socially, emotionally yet, it's going to be really hard for them to be successful on that assignment. So trying to help them figure out how to cope with that is just as important as understanding your content and giving a really amazing lecture to your students.
Yeah, this is an amazing amount of content in this presentation. As I listen, I know we said we wouldn't go to research, but as I hear each of the principles. I just hear the researchers and learning theories that we know about in the field ringing off the support for each one. This
Yeah.
is unbelievable.
And that's something that's unique about Universal Design for Learning. Each one of the UDL checkpoints has a research study that's attached to it, actually multiple ones, and you can read them all on the UDL Center. And some of them are studies that took place years ago that are related to just really good pedagogy, and others have to do with advances in the neurosciences. And UDL evolves, and that also sets it apart from other frameworks. So this last slide that I'd like to just talk about briefly, few strategies to help students self-regulate. Timely personal check-ins. So we talked about that with the emails. You can also set up online site for students to do this. I know in my own doctoral program we had a blog, and we all had to talk about what we were doing, and we had a really rich online community. It's a great way to help people self-regulate because you can see what your colleagues are up to. Using formative assessment, I have a screenshot of the book that I alluded to a couple minutes ago. I can't say enough about increasing your level of formative assessment, because you're checking in. The purpose of formative assessment is to help you change your instruction, but in sharing how you changed your instruction, you're also helping your students be able to self-regulate because they know how they're doing in the context of your expectation. Celebrating progress publicly. I don't think we do this enough. I have a screenshot of the bottom. There's little videos there. And this is from a school that I work with. And they find teachers who are doing things really well, and they spotlight them on the website. We can do this with our students at the beginning of class, the end of class. You know, I don't think we celebrate their successes often enough. Displaying assessment data results visually, and also making sure that it's anonymous so that we're not, you know, students know what they score on exams, but it's also helpful to see, you know, where you are and where you need to grow. Google Docs, Google Forms is such an easy way to do this. You can set up a form, you can have students answer at the beginning or end of class, and you can display that. And then finally, building in reflective learning activities. One of my favorite ways to do this is to have students blog, to have students tweet, and they can basically share their feelings on the course, on how they are, and sometimes you're going to get a lot more from them in a written format using social media than you will face-to-face in your class. So that's just a way that I use to help increase that capacity and help students learn to monitor their emotions and how they really perceive the class and how it's going and their own skill level. But we've got to give them those opportunities because they're not going to tell us at the end necessarily.
Absolutely. And so this was just a packed presentation, Dr. Berquist. There are so many wonderful points that I can think of to recap right now. But to me, it sounds like UDL is not just a learning theory. It's almost like a conglomerate of learning theories, and those principles that we discussed and guidelines are built not necessarily from just one study, but they're built from everywhere. They don't just take into account the grades, or they don't just take into account presentation or course design. They take into account the learner's needs and the learner's feelings and all of those concepts at the same time. And this really sounds like something that is an amazing way to get through to a larger percentage of your learners and to probably increase retention among the learners that you already are getting through to and help them learn more.
Absolutely.
So,
yeah, one thing that makes UDL unique is that it places, when you look at the 3 guidelines, you know, options for engagement, representation, action, and expression, those are based on those 3 networks, strategic, affective, and recognition. It puts the affective network on the same plane as recognition and strategic. And you know, when you look back at the way classrooms and learning environments and higher education were designed, the way that we thought about content and how students show what they know was up here, and then the affective piece was down here. So UDL puts all of these equally important. And just a final reminder, if there's anyone who is watching that's new, we really honed in on the affective piece. We could spend the same amount of time talking about how to support recognition networks and strategic networks. So hopefully that's your teaser to go learn more. We talked about strategies to support student affect. If you want to learn more about supporting student recognition networks or supporting student strategic networks, you can go to the UDL Center, you can go to the Towson OAI site, you can go to the UDL on campus site. Those are great places to learn more, and I hope that this session really encourages folks to keep on learning when they design their classrooms for their upcoming semesters.
Yeah, that's great. I hope it does too, and I really think that it would be great for folks to start to try to enact this. I'll recap what you had said earlier to save a few moments, since we are running a little bit short on time today. Our main question that we usually ask at the end of the presentations, we always say, how can faculty here at Towson or at some of the other universities that are involved today get involved? We know that we have the Office of Academic Innovation, which is part of our UDL on-campus effort. And do you have any other websites perhaps that you could recommend for the reading?
Yes, yeah, there's an excellent textbook that David Rose, Ann Meyer, and David Gordon, they actually, it's a redo of the original seminal work on UDL, and it's udltheorytopractice.cast.org. It's digital, so it's got lots and lots of ideas for learning about UDL and getting started with it. And you can find that by just doing a Google for UDL Theory to Practice, and you want the online book, and it's free.
This was such a packed presentation. It looks like we're running out of time. So
sorry about that.
Oh, no problem. It's nothing to apologize for. At this time, I'd like to first thank you, yourself, as well, moving back to our team. I'd like to send special thanks first to our moderator, Julie Wong, who is one of our graduate assistants, our videographer, David Marino, who is handling all of the high-definition cameras that you see in the background, OII's service manager, Latanya Dyer, as well as our assistant provost, Dr. Jane Neapolitan, and everybody else in the OAI team, who might take a few seconds to mention all those names. But once again, this is our final episode for the season, so hopefully we'll see you in the fall. And I'd like to say, once again, just to close, thanks from the tank.